All right, well, welcome everybody to Playground's Robochat event series, our March 2021 edition. For those of you not familiar with Playground Global, we are an early stage venture capital firm based in Palo Alto, California. We invest in frontier technologies, so think qubits, photons, electrons, small molecules, proteins, and as we like to think about it, we invest in companies that will build a future that we would like to inhabit. So think quantum computing, 3D printed rockets, small molecules and proteins and stuff like that. The Robochat event series brings together experts and world-class leaders in the space, in the areas of robotics, automation, AI, next-gen compute, cybersecurity, to discuss current state of the art, challenges, and upcoming trends. My name is Sasha Ostojic. I'm an operating partner with Playground Global, and I'm really excited to talk to our amazing guest, Michael Johnson. First off, for those of you who came to see the 4-time Olympic gold medalist, the gold shoes, you are in the wrong event. This is not that Michael Johnson. This Michael Johnson has different type of gold shoes that maybe he will or will not show us. I have no idea. So, Michael, actually first some housekeeping to make sure I cover that. This event is being recorded and will be shared with all of you following the event. So you can watch it later, come back with questions, ideas, and we encourage our community to engage with us after every event. If you have questions for Michael, please submit your questions via the stage chat feature. I see there's already a lot of activity there, so please do post questions. So we're sure to ask questions of interest and cover topics that are top of mind. We will also try to cover pre-submitted questions. And then if you're experiencing any technical issues or would like to contact the event organizer, please do use the event chat feature. So that's just another tab that you will see there. All right. So no further ado, Michael Johnson, former Chief Information and Security Officer at Capital One. Doesn't get bigger than that. Senior security roles at Department of Energy and other 3-letter acronym national agencies that we may or may not mention. So Michael, these are some really important roles in charge of protecting assets of immense value. So while you were active in those roles, how did you sleep at night?
Sasha, it's wonderful to be here. Good morning, good afternoon to everyone. And thanks for making time. I'm a big, huge fan of Playground, so I appreciate getting this. You know, the classic saying when you're in security is, right, you have time to sleep when you're dead. The short answer is always unknown unknowns, right? So you're always worried about what you don't know. And in particular, though, if you drill down one level, what you really worry about is like nation state capable adversaries who are already possibly embedded in your systems and laying in wait for a time of their choosing to do something which would damage your company or your organization. So that's what really keeps you up at night. In truth, what you really try to do though, right, is prepare organizations to be well managed in cyber such that when something happens, not if, that everyone is sort of on the same page about understanding, you know, where they are, what the prioritizations have been, what the trade-offs have been, and what they need to do to restore the company or their organization back to its operating mode. So.
All right, makes sense. I like that. Sleep when you're dead. In the meantime, there's work to be done and stuff to be protected. Yeah. All right, so cyber. There are so many different perspectives on what even cyber is, what is or is not important. Help us with some key definitions and concepts so we can have a framework as we dig deeper into different areas within cyber.
Yeah, that's a really great place to start, Sasha. So like if you ask 10 people, what does cyber mean to them? You'll get 10 different answers, as you know. And too often when you talk to people, when you talk about cyber, they think very narrowly about what I'll call cybersecurity and specifically tactical cybersecurity. So things like network or ring defense, intrusion detection, those kind of things. And all of that is super, super important. But it's really important when you talk about cyber to step back and take a broad view of it. So I like to talk about a broad definition of cyber being the use of information and technology to both enable and safeguard a business. And the reason that's really important is if you don't get sort of information discovery and information access and information availability and data analytics and all those things correctly, you can spend as much money as you want on the safeguarding side, you know, like have a $1 billion cyber intelligence program, but it won't matter. because you won't be successful. So number one is to have that broad definition of cyber. Number two is to understand that cyber really is existential for trust-based digital businesses, and that's really everybody, right? Everybody's in a digital business now, and it's just a concrete example of that. I won't refer to specific companies, but I'll give you real examples. I've worked with a Fortune 50 company that only has 30 days worth of streaming backups for all their core information systems, right? So if you just stop for a moment and think about that, if you're an adversary and you got a foothold in their systems and you lay in wait for 30 days and then corrupt their backups, that company doesn't exist anymore. The other thing is, most companies operate really complex hybrid technology environments, and cyber is also a weakest link problem, right? So it's the classic thing everyone talks about, right? You just have to be the faster of the two deer to get away from the bear kind of a problem. Companies really have to look at sort of broadly how they're doing in enterprise risk management and make sure that they're doing best effort across the board. You can't let anything go. And then a couple last concepts. One is everybody's aware of sort of the exponential growth and the frequency and the enhanced sophistication of cyber threats. But it's really important to understand that almost all companies have to simultaneously defend against a broad spectrum of threat actors, right? So I sort of classify them in three sort of clumps. One is thieves. These are people who want to steal non-public information and monetize it against you. The second group is thugs. These are people who want to do damage, want to sucker punch an organization or make them look bad. That would be things like defacing a website, etc. And then, as has been in the news a lot lately, we've got a lot of good examples we can talk about. There's the spies or the saboteurs, right? So these are the people who professionally go after others in an offensive way from a cybersecurity point of view. And there's really two main buckets within that sub-bucket, which is one is around espionage, which is data collection, to get information or decision advantage over your adversary. And then there's saboteurs, which I just gave you an example of, like laying in wait or co-opting a system to take advantage of it. And what's super important about this is you can't just focus on one and ignore the others, because if you do, of course, you'll be had. And furthermore, the sort of capabilities and intent of these threat actors are very, very different. And so you always need to step back and think about cyber risk as being sort of the cross product, if you will, of threat, vulnerabilities, and consequences. So if you think that's a classic definition of risk, but if you think like, okay, what are the threats that my business or my company or my organization faces? What are the capabilities and intent of those adversaries? What vulnerabilities do I have in my environment? And what of those can I drive down, eliminate, mitigate, et cetera? And then what are the consequences for the business if one of those were actually perpetrated? And when you look at that, then what you need to do is prioritize against those by looking at the threats you face and the risk outcomes, and then sort of bin things in three areas. One is, what are the existential threats that if you don't eliminate could ruin your company, right? And a really good example of this, which didn't ruin the company completely, but really damaged them, is in June of 2018, there was an event with Banco de Chile, where there was an attack by a nation state capable adversary, where they stole a bunch of money through the SWIFT network for data transfer and money transfer. And on exiting out of those systems, they actually executed a wiper system that destroyed thousands and thousands of their servers and their endpoints. And the company had to literally go back to paper-based processes for a number of weeks. So that first one is sort of existential. The second is at scale, right? So like, what are at-scale attacks that could attack your company and cause you to either go down or severely be limited for a long period of time? Massive DDoS attacks are a best example of that. And then the third is just what are the most common and the easiest and the most likely, given sort of the state of things. And ransomware is the best example of what you see right now.
All right, well, thanks for that framing, because that'll help us guide the discussion moving forward. And I like that. Thieves, thugs, spies, and saboteurs. Cybersecurity seems to be a sea of acronyms, so TTSS must be one of those. There. All right. So now that we have a framework, let's talk a little bit about the evolution of cyber. Where we were many years ago, where we are today, and then we'll get into the future. I remember back in the early to mid 90s when I stood up my very first web server for my company, Ultimate Technology, at the time. We put up this web server running on a PC in our office, and we were so proud. We had a website that had all the crazy fonts and HTML things that were hip at the time. And we come back in the morning and the entire thing is defaced with a state propaganda from Asia, with flags and slogans like, whoa, and then you start digging in and, it was kind of vandalism, but nothing really bad happened. So that's kind of, give us an idea of that evolution.
Yeah. So I'd say those are the thugs that got you there. So it's to talk about the evolution of cybersecurity, which we'll do just briefly. It's really important to step back and sort of use an analogy, because for most people, sort of talking about cyber threats and how it relates to digital systems is really dependent on what your knowledge is of your information technology footprint, that sort of thing. So I always like to think about home defense analogy. So in evolution over the past 20 years, there's been sort of 5 phases, and we're sort of in the evolution between phase 4 and phase 5 in maturity. So sort of as a society, if you look back like 20, 25 years ago, we were in a mode I would call unaware or reactive. So again, I'm going to use a home defense analogy. So if you think of like you have a home, but the doors are open, the windows are open, and sort of once a week you look around and look under the couch to see if there's anything bad happening. This was sort of where we were 20 years ago, where we did weekly virus scans on our computer looking for, static threats. And then we evolved from there to what was classically called perimeter defense, right? And home defense analogy, this would be like I have a fence out around my home and I'm watching to see if a bad guy jumps over the fence, right? But that whole sort of hard outer shell approach to defending things really fell out of favor, say 12, 15 years ago, right? Because as we all know, bad guys will like dig under the fence or, parachute over, that sort of thing. And so this is sort of the getting away from fixed rule firewalls and intrusion detection systems, and sort of the overemphasis of just externally facing versus internally facing systems. Sort of the third evolution then is what is called defense in depth. And you'll still hear people relying on defense in depth, and there's nothing wrong with it as a concept, but sort of we've grown beyond it, right? The concept of defense in depth is that you've got your home, you've got all your doors locked, you've got all your windows locked, and let's say you've even fortified your front door, right? So a bad guy must be super overt to break it in. Like they can't just kick it in with their foot. They would have to hit it with a battering ram or a vehicle to knock that door in. The idea there is they have to be so loud and invest so much time and energy, right? That you would hear it, right? And you would understand it. And so this is sort of where these complementary layers are such that it adds to the time and energy that an adversary has to invest so that you can protect your crown jewels, et cetera, and be aware or monitor if something bad happens. Where we've evolved to now, sort of is the fourth generation of all this, is what I like to call proactive or predictive. So going back to our home defense analogy, this is sort of like the neighborhood watch program, right? So there's real-time sharing of information, especially sort of in the network effect sense between vendor solutions, where a threat to one is immediately known by the others and you're inoculated. So there's lots of companies that do this well, like Proofpoint or Palo Alto Networks, et cetera, where if they see a threat somewhere in their environment, within seconds, the rest of their customers are inoculated against that. And that automated real-time sharing of information then protects everyone. The idea in that environment is 0 days can still happen, and we'll probably talk about some today that have been happening recently, but they only happen once and they only happen against one person, and everyone else benefits from that. And then where we're going, my opinion only, is to resilient by design, right? And this is where the home analogy gets a little harder, but I'll try to include it, right? So if you think of a home design where every single room is autonomous and independent and has limited functionality, so you have a kitchen which is connected to a bedroom, which is connected to a living room, et cetera. And let's say one day you walk in and there's a bad guy in your kitchen. No problem. I just blow that kitchen away and get a brand new kitchen, right? So limited functionality, known and closely monitored, where, for example, like if you are in a containerized environment, you're watching all of the system calls. If there's a system call or a misbehaving process, just blow it away and start again. Like you don't have to worry about it. It's not a big deal. So excuse me. So getting to that resilient by design is sort of where we're trying to go to now.
So in the future, every room is a panic room.
There you go.
We'll get there. All right. So we framed it. I love the home security analogy. All right, let's dig into the nature of the threat landscape and some specific incidents that made headlines. Obviously there's SolarWinds. You touched on it briefly. Microsoft Exchange RCE, Deer Cry, but they all kind of refer to certain categories of threats. So please elaborate. And let's dig into those.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I'll start at the top of your list. I think here's what's interesting though. If you're a cybersecurity person, you've got at least 5 or 6 really, really good examples of major cybersecurity threats happening just in the last 3 months. Like these are all like really, really good examples to understand and dig into. So let's do that. So let's start with SolarWinds. So SolarWinds is an example of a supply chain compromise. And you may have heard of people talking about supply chain compromise as being one of those wickedly hard problems to solve, and it really is. Supply chain compromise is usually almost always something that is used by nation state capable adversaries, so the spies and saboteurs we talked about earlier. And when you talk about SolarWinds, it's really referring to the SolarWinds, the company, and their Orion network management products. If you look at this, it really demonstrates the patience and sophistication of the adversary. And again, this is a classic case of espionage intended for data collection, not for financial gain. So, right, what's important when you talk about SolarWinds is not was an organization infected, because many organizations were infected. It's really was the organization infected and targeted for exploitation, right? So in this attack, the threat actor was able to inject a backdoor into SolarWinds Orion software by modifying the source code of an existing plugin, which was then signed by SolarWinds and published as part of its update to its customers, right? And so what's really interesting about that, there's several things. One is that update was correctly digitally signed, right? So it implies that SolarWinds and its keys were compromised long ago. And sort of, if you read through all the reports and get into the details, a nice touch was the exploit was masquerading as, quote, an Orion improvement protocol to improve the quality of their products, which of course, in a sense for the bad guys, it did. SolarWinds products, as you probably have read, are used by like 300,000 customers worldwide, including, the US government, 425 of the Fortune 500 companies, et cetera. And the impacted versions of the Orion monitoring products were out in like March and June of this last year. But it's really interesting to look at the attention and the focus of a nation state adversary, to look at the timeline. So it appears now, after post-analysis, that the threat actors accessed SolarWinds back in September 4th of 2019, and they conducted their first known test in September 12th of 2019. Sunburst, as it's called, was not compiled or deployed until February 20th of 2020. And according to SolarWinds timeline, in June 2020, the hackers removed it already from the SolarGate process and the build process. And it wasn't until December that we discovered the vulnerability. So who knows how long the adversary had been planning, but they had started this effort back in 2019 and didn't even try compiling it into the environment until February 20th. And then, of course, as people probably know, DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, CISA, they released their emergency directive on this on the 13th of December. So even though like 18,000 SolarWinds customers were infected by this because they downloaded this update, by looking at domain name, system logs, et cetera, the estimates are between 200, maybe as many as 500 organizations were actually infected and impacted. But what's interesting, if you look at it, is the types of companies, et cetera, that were exploited, right? So the US government agencies, which we've read about, networking companies, healthcare providers, banks, semiconductor manufacturers, et cetera. As is widely published now, I think Microsoft, their threat intelligence center, named this threat actor Nobelium, but others, including the US government, have implied that it's APT29, so Cozy Bear. And of the strains that have been looked at, there have been sort of 7 malware strains associated with this attack, including Sunburst, Teardrop, Sunspot, and a number of others. They even just 2 weeks ago discovered 4 new strains that were deposited and used as part of this. And what's super interesting, according to analysis, is some of this code has no overlap with any previously seen malware. So again, this is talking to the sophistication of the adversary. Two last ahas on this one I think are really interesting. I have personally talked to a number of companies, one notable one of the biggest insurance companies in the United States, who were so far behind in their patching that they had not yet downloaded and installed the effective update. And so their comment to their board was, hey, look, us being a little behind actually paid off. I would just point out being behind in patching is not a really good cybersecurity strategy. Number 2, there's 2 really interesting notable outcomes from this, in addition to all the stuff that's in the press. Number 1, right, is that it appears, as published by FireEye, that the FireEye penetration testing tools that they use commercially were stolen, including the details of how they were made, et cetera. And in addition, it looks like the threat actors used Orion as a means to generate SAML tokens, or security assertion markup language tokens, giving them access to companies' Microsoft 365, Azure, and Active Directory instances, which allowed them to immediately elevate privileges and roam pretty freely within those systems and have more broad access. So that really talks to the concern of the long-term embedding of the adversary within those companies that were actually exploited. So I'll stop there in case you have any questions.
Yeah, no, that's good. You know, I like your example of somebody being lazy and getting lucky and naming that a strategy. All right. So, you know, we do have a lot of people in the audience who care about automation, robotics, AI. So let's touch on that, understanding you're not a robotics expert, yet a lot of the threat vectors and, you know, and approaches are very much applicable, especially if you think about all the data that's being collected and transmitted and the damage that can be caused, because these robots and automation, they're physical things that can cause not only loss of data and security, but they can cause physical damage. So what are some security considerations that you can think of? You know, when robots have remote assistance, over-the-air updates, you know, they have sensors, tons of data, you know, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think of robotics, right, and sort of what I'll call digital physical systems. They have the same dimension of digital systems as it relates to cybersecurity. And just to remind everyone, when you think of classic cybersecurity, you think of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The only thing that digital physical systems add to that they have those same concerns, right, is the dimension of safety, right? Because it has a physical system, it can actually physically impact the world. And so, you know, we can talk about robotics, like classic robotics in industrial sense, or in like a home sense, but you can talk about, you know, automated self-driving cars, you can talk about, you know, airplanes, you can talk about nuclear weapons, even if you want. And so the key with that, right, from a perspective, is to understand how do those now 4 dimensions, as opposed to only 3 dimensions, how are those impacted by security, and what do you need to consider? And really the main thing you need to focus on when you're talking about those is how you essentially do supply chain and vulnerability management best practices. In other words, how do you understand holistically what you have, how it's controlled, how you're managing it, and how you oversee and make sure it works correctly. So there's like 4 main pieces to that. And again, this is driving all 4 of those to include safety. One is making sure that you understand in an automated collection way, so you're not dependent on human beings to do it. Really understand from a continuous assessment point of view, factually, what the threats are faced and what the exposure is for the environment, right? So the way this is done traditionally, sort of in third-party management, is people have like a clipboard and they sit and ask questions, you know, like, do you have an incident response plan? You know, how much of your source code is open source, all that kind of stuff. But where we've evolved to now is that companies now are implementing sort of automated testing and verification of systems through automated sort of verification of code, et cetera. And this gets into how you do vulnerability management. So it's not just static analysis of code you control, but it's sort of, I think the right term is software composition analysis of binaries for which you don't have control of the code, and dynamic testing of the system itself. And then the next part is formally conveying the attestation of sort of the hardware, firmware, and the software and what it's supposed to do. And there's a number of efforts right now around software bills of material or digital bills of material, where you essentially have policy as code, which says what the software is made of and how it is supposed to perform. And then you can, in theory, in an automated way, do third-party automated testing of this. And I think there's a DBOM project within GitHub for people who are interested in that sort of thing. And then more broadly, stepping back around comprehensive vulnerability management, like I said, you know, static testing, composition testing, dynamic testing I'm a big fan of making sure you're being very explicit about threat modeling and penetration testing of your systems. And that includes understanding, for example, for a robotic system, how is it to be used? What are the threats that it poses to the environment, or that the environment poses to it, and make sure that you're testing against those threats and that that's built into your testing regime.
Yeah. So let me dig into this a little bit because this is about the current state of affairs. You talk about testing and penetration testing, and in my previous lives, I've dealt with this. Because I was shipping real world products, so we would do external penetration testing, scanning tools. You get inundated by tons of alerts and data, and you look at it, it's like, where do I even start? I have 5,897 alerts and warnings. And how do you make sense of this?
Yep. That's the number one question. And by the way, this is where machine learning is super, super important, right? So it's the classic problem of I've got lots of signal and lots of noise, and I've got to sort out the signal and prioritize my most valuable resource, which are my analysts and the people who can actually fix and resolve problems. And so the question is, how do you prioritize it? And the good news is there's lots of solutions how to do this now. So sort of the two that I'm most fond of are making sure you have comprehensive asset management. And by comprehensive asset management, not just where you're relying on people to have told you what the assets are within your environment, but that you're proactively searching your environment and understanding how things are working and how they're communicating, et cetera. So there are a number of solutions now that do this really well. One of the ones I'm a big fan of, but not to plug any one company, is Armis. They essentially passively watch the network. They watch the flow of data. They have a database of over, I think it's almost 500 million objects within their environment, where they've seen every network switch, every IoT device, every endpoint, and they know how they should perform. And so they will tell you just passively by watching the net flows what objects are on your network, what they're doing, et cetera, and be able to detect abnormal from normal behavior, and then allow you to tee off that, which allows you to prioritize. And then I would say the second technology that's really coming about right now, which is super important, is real quantitative enterprise cyber risk methodologies. So this is where you're not just qualitatively discussing and talking about what your risk is and how to evaluate it. You're comprehensively looking across things like your people, your policies, your assets, including IoT, et cetera, and you're applying Bayesian networks and machine learning to understand, all things being equal, what's the next most important thing I should focus on, that my analyst should be focusing on from a threat point of view, and that my development team should be focusing on from a vulnerability point of view, and then prioritize and monitor that risk in real time to actually drive your risk profile down. And there's many solutions that do this too. Safe Security is one, Whitehawk's another, where they have automated that to the point where once you've instrumented your environment, you can get that sort of continuous assessment and then make sure you're prioritizing on the right things. And again, all based on machine learning in large numbers of the back-end data flows to understand how to do that quantification.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and I'm glad you touched on machine learning. There are a lot of questions about that, and obviously, machine learning is very effective in a lot of different domains. And as you were talking, I was thinking of an analogy. A radiologist, from Stanford said, AI is not going to replace radiologists, but radiologists using AI will replace radiologists not using AI.
Yeah.
So I bet the same applies to cybersecurity professionals as well.
Absolutely.
So let's use this, to dig into what tools we have at our disposal. How do we fight back, and after that, then we'll go deeper into the future.
Yeah. So if you remember, right, we started out by talking about sort of how do you prioritize your risks? You look at the threat capabilities and how do you look at them? And the number one thing you want to do is, to what extent can you remove risks from the environment altogether? So can you take a threat capability and eliminate it so you don't need to worry about it anymore, right? It's not a concern within your environment. So eliminating those threats. So there's really great cutting edge technologies now that are available that do this. So one of the ones I'm most fond around is secure enclaves, right? So secure enclaves is sort of the next generation 10 years later from trusted processing modules, or TPMs, if people remember that, right? So the idea with secure enclaves is that you have CPU level memory encryption on every server, automatically encrypting the memory of the application and the data, everything running in the enclave. So for anyone who's worked in this area in the past, you had to be very selective about, maybe just my keys or maybe just a small part of the memory was I able to encrypt. Now with the new technology, you can encrypt the entire application, and with some added additional software, you not only encrypt the memory, but you encrypt the storage and the network in an end-to-end way, such that it is completely protected. And The beauty about secure enclaves is this is hardware that is now available and been deployed. And as an example, all the major cloud providers have this. So if you're on like an Azure, they have confidential computing, AWS has Nitro enclaves, et cetera. And what this does then is it creates a security perimeter around your application. And if you use enterprise solutions, one that I happen to know is a Playground portfolio company is Anjuna. If you use like Anjuna as an example as their enterprise solution, you can create this perimeter around the applications without requiring any changes to your application. You're just basically running on top of their platform. The data is automatically protected anywhere by default, whether it's at rest, in transit, or in use. And the solution works across every one of the clouds seamlessly. And so the nice thing about this is, depending on sort of how you define the threats, like you've eliminated like 4 or 5 major threats, right? So sensitive workloads can safely be operated in contested or hostile environments because everything is cryptographically encrypted, right? Escalation of privileges is no longer possible, right? A system admin can't get into the application. You prevent over-provisioning of credentials. There's no unencrypted transmission across untrusted networks. Man-in-the-middle attacks are greatly reduced, that sort of thing. So it eliminates all these classes, which really makes it powerful.
Just quickly, for the record, we love it when our amazing guests mention our portfolio companies. We don't ask our guests to go there, but we love it when one of our portfolio companies like Anjuna is in the middle of solving a crucial problem and is actually the poster child for that solution. And Anjuna really is. Thank you for that.
Agreed. Yep. So some of the other technologies. So I mentioned already enterprise cyber risk quantification. I just want to emphasize one thing about that, though. It's super important. Sort of from a business point of view. So like one person's opinion only. It's every corporate board of directors' fiduciary responsibility to ensure the corporate management team is quantitatively managing enterprise cyber risk. And I can literally count on one hand the number of companies that I know that are actually doing this, right? So if you sit and talk to anybody who's on a public board and ask them, hey, tell me, how is your management team for your company quantitatively managing enterprise cyber risk? I guarantee their mouth will fall open. And so these technologies that allow you to instrument your environment and do that for you, it really has a powerful effect of getting everyone on the same page and what should be prioritized from a transparency point of view. But B, it actually gives you a quantitative baseline to understand what your as is, what your to be needs to be, and then have really important conversations about sort of, what is our risk appetite and what is our tolerance, and how do we drive that to where we need to go. So I can't say enough about the importance of that. And if you look, one of the most important sort of industry trends that I see coming on this is known as the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, or the CMMC. I won't go into a lot of detail because maybe a lot of people here won't be interested, but the U.S. Department of Defense is now imposing for all future contracts that companies meet this new level of certification. And essentially what it does is it requires people to have independent verification that they meet certain levels of cybersecurity maturity and effectiveness. And my belief is within 2 years, all companies will be doing this or required to do this to meet shareholder expectations. The last sort of game-changing technology I'll just mention, but we can talk about more, is a term that was coined by Gartner back in 2019, Secure Access Service Edge, or SASE. I didn't come up with the acronym. And the concept behind SASE, which is super powerful, right, is it takes sort of the team of people that run your NOC, or your Network Operations Center, and the people that run your SOC, or your Security Operations Center, and it melds them together into one technology stack. So it integrates key components from networking, so SD-WAN, DNS, WAN optimization, et cetera, and security, so network security, CASB, et cetera, and puts it into a unified collection where you're managing it as one whole. I think where SASE solutions are being targeted right now is primarily towards like the small and medium businesses, the SMBs. But I believe if well integrated, the company that comes up with the best, cleanest solution, I believe they'll take over all networking and security operations for most companies, even Fortune 100 large companies.
Well, sounds like a huge opportunity in the SASE space. Cool. All right. So we covered a lot. Let's look at the future now. The way I think about this and the role of security, AI does play a role, but I think about it like chess programs are so good right now. There are no humans left for computers to play with because they beat everybody on a regular basis. So now computers play computers. Are we going to get to a point where cybersecurity bots are fighting other cybersecurity bots in the future?
Yeah. So let's do that. Let's play this mental game. I love talking about it. So if you think about the logical evolution, so let's walk through this just for a minute. So if I claim that we're 5 years from now, maybe 10, who knows, but I'm able to eliminate all nuisance threats, right? So we really are following resilient by design, some of the other concepts that we already talked about. So I've eliminated all the nuisance threats. They don't exist anymore. We don't need to worry about them. They're handled. Then if I also have comprehensive real-time scanning and automated remediation for both configuration problems like, say, configuration drift and known vulnerabilities, then all that leaves is 0 days, right? Things that we don't know about that we've never seen before. And so I personally believe this is like the biggest opportunity for computers to explore the solution space of potential 0-day exploits more quickly and completely. So as anyone in computer science knows, right, sort of deterministically understanding all paths within a fairly large program is sort of a non-polynomial, and it's an NP complete kind of problem. And so my belief is we will eventually get to where sort of high performance computing calculates the permutations to find 0 days and exploits. And you have another high performance computing that's doing the same thing to try to find them and remediate and resolve them before they are discovered by the other computer. And what it comes down to then is who has the best computers, who has the best algorithms in this offensive defensive posturing. And what that really comes down to is who has the most capable, scalable, and powerful, read power hungry sort of capabilities. So who's most technologically advanced and who from an energy usage point of view can field the largest, most capable computer to stay ahead of the others.
Yeah, that's an interesting dystopian future, where humans will be just monitoring, catching exceptions, I guess at that point. All right, so I think that we did great with timing and covering topics that I really wanted us to dig into. So I will now turn to the pre-submitted questions and then monitor the real-time questions as well. So we'll start with Hadi Nahari, founder and CEO of Cognomotive. He asks, APTs aside, we talked about a lot of three-letter acronyms. I think APTs, active persistent threats. Is AI really making the already existing threat vectors more monetizable, basically, for these threat actors? And is AI making these actors happier, and why? How do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll even generalize that a little more. Hopefully that's okay. The question is, what signs and signals do we have that threat actors are actually using machine learning and AI to sort of hone their craft? There have been some indications that there is use of machine learning as it relates to selecting the diversity and spread of bot networks, very specifically expensive bot networks that are used to go after financial institutions and others. There's indications of that. There's also indications of use of machine learning and advanced learning techniques as it relates for countering know your customer. So sort of a classic sort of KYC type applications. And where we've seen that is, so traditionally like automated traffic is a big problem, right? DDoS and credential stuffing coming into, for example, financial institutions. And the way you try to address that, right, is you try to get the pattern of life signature of a customer such that that's really the customer and not some bad guy who's stolen their credentials trying to come in. What the bad guys are doing now is looking at sort of the inverse of that, like how many degrees of freedom is the institution looking at to understand what their customers look at, and then trying to, as best they can, simulate real human beings on the other side to sort of counter that, and to include things like, I'm aware of a large phone bot network that was set up in South America where they actually deployed thousands and thousands of Android devices, so real physical devices that people would actually handle and move, et cetera, so that the servos and all that were detecting the right movements, et cetera, and then use that in their modeling to try to advance against the banks in their credential stuffing attacks.
Well, interesting. All right. Next, one of the pre-submitted questions. Jim Burnham, our favorite mechatronics engineering instructor for high school students in Silicon Valley. So he'd like to know, are there some robots or AI devices And I think we can broaden that to mission critical systems and automation equipment that should just never be connected to the network.
Yeah, I spent most of my career working on national security systems, including high consequence systems. Absolutely, if you have a super high consequence system, it shouldn't be on the network, right? The idea of something being on a network is a convenience, either for management or monitoring, etc. And so there's sort of a trade-off you've got to play here. How critical is the system, right? How important is the trade-off between real-time management and monitoring that you get by having it connected versus having it on an out-of-band network that you separately monitor, separately control, can separately harden, etc. And you've got to make that trade-off and understand what the ramifications of that are. I mean, what's really interesting about that question, which I like about that question, is we just saw an example of this. So those people were watching the news, right, in February, right, the water treatment plant out of, I think it's Oldsmar, Florida, right. There was a press conference where the local sheriff talked about how one of their control systems, I think it was based on TeamView, had been hacked, etc. But when you step back and look at that, none of those water treatment plants or facilities are, there's no one sitting or staff there. It's all being done remote. And of course, the investment in technology there is way lagging. So there was outdated versions of computers, right? People were sharing weak passwords, like there was a bunch of other things. If that was truly a mission critical environment, you would have a out-of-band separate network where you purposely encrypt it, you monitor the traffic to make sure there's only specific types of messages flowing, et cetera, et cetera. You would really harden that down, just like we do with really sensitive command and control networks.
Benjamin Fredrickson is asking, I mean, we covered this a little bit, but this is more specific to the healthcare industry. As third-party infrastructure, how do we help make things like hospital networks more secure? There were some hospitals in the news that were victims of ransomware attacks, and they had to pay to actually get their data back.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that specifically?
Yeah. Well, so let's see. Yeah. Well, let me split that into two pieces. So ransomware is well understood. Most of the signs and signatures as it relates to ransomware are things for which static and dynamic analysis of your, I'll call it your endpoints and your network feeds are such that you can identify and eliminate. So if you have a comprehensive, like DLP program that looks at flows through email, flows through social networking, if you don't have browser isolation, endpoint monitoring and network monitoring, you will catch and either be able to eliminate or isolate those when they land on the endpoint. The problem is, which is the second part I'll answer now, is most companies, I'm assuming most healthcare companies, et cetera, maybe aren't just as far along in sort of their cybersecurity journey, and so don't have those capabilities. And I think that's where you really have to step back and analyze again against what we talked about before, which is sort of prioritizing existential at scale and then the most common. Ransomware, as driven by sort of phishing and social attacking techniques, is the most common. And so that's where you would really want to step back and look at the architecture that they've deployed at one of these healthcare institutions and make sure that it is resilient against those type of attack vectors. But I'm not aware of any signature-based ransomware attack which is not easily identifiable by current solutions that are available in the DLP market. So I think it's just making sure that we modernize those environments to address those attack vectors.
Along those lines, so these institutions had to pay. How do you feel about actually having to pay to get your systems back? Is that the right way to handle it, or do you fight back? I don't know what the answer is.
Well, so there's sort of three answers to that, right? So one is if you have a robust backup system, right, and you have robust monitoring such that you can detect the threat in time, still within the window of your backup, you just restore your backups, and you will have lost some amount of work and some amount of progress, but you're still in control of your own system. So that's number one. Number two is there are lots of services you can pay. What they call hack back services against, I'll just be clear, it is against the law for anyone but the federal government to do anything offensively in the cyber realm. However, there are companies who specialize in understanding the various different types of ransomware, and they will, for a service, run very large computers against that ransomware to try to break them. So essentially giving you the key without you having to pay the ransom. And then finally, the third piece is, like, at the end of the day, if your backup strategy didn't work and one of these companies isn't able to help you, then essentially you've got to pay the ransom or you've lost your company, right? From an existential point of view, assuming you're not able to sort of like burn down all of your IT systems and start from scratch. So for those companies or entities that have no other choice, I think that's, you know, perfectly reasonable approach. Again, it's either that or your company goes out of business. The one thing to keep in mind, though, many of the ransomware attacks include the disposition of secondary payloads and other things that even once you pay the ransom, there is still some deep embedding within the systems. And so you have to be very, very mindful of, even if your backups didn't work and you have to pay the ransom, that you still then need to be in a sort of a mode that you're going to have to clean and burn your systems and reset them completely to make sure you've eradicated the threat.
Yeah, that's the hidden expense. Not just that you paid millions of dollars, but now you have to rebuild everything, cleanse your systems, and that's probably then more costly than the ransom you paid.
Yeah, absolutely.
The recovery part. Yeah. All right. There are a lot of questions, that are AI related. For example, Hadi again, how would an AI cyber system address the adversarial AI? To take it to the next level, there are going to be fleets or confederations of AIs, both as attackers and defenders. I guess they go back to bots fighting bots. I don't know if there's anything to add there.
I just think, two things. This is going to be really boring. Sorry. There's two parts to it. As long as you're well managed, so let me step back and tell you why this is important, right? So as a CISO or CIO, what you want to be able to say, for example, to your shareholders, your board of directors, or whatever, you always want to be able to say like three things, right? So I've always wanted to be able to walk into the boardroom and say three things. I've got complete visibility across the entire digital footprint of the company. I know where everything is. I know where every 1 and 0 is. I know where every piece of important information is. I can see it all. Number two is, for all known vulnerabilities in the world, right? So for all those exist, we have 0 within our environment. We've burnt them all down, so there's no known vulnerabilities in the environment. And third, I have complete insight into what is normal and abnormal behavior across my entire environment. Now, nobody can say this, and nobody can ever say this because it's too complex. But if you could say those things, right, then to answer the question, again, told you it wasn't going to be very exciting, to answer the question, then what you're essentially doing is you're looking, like we talked about before, at what is 0-day unknown kind of things and mapping that to the context of your company, what you know about your visibility of your digital footprint, your known 0 vulnerabilities, and your insights into what normal and abnormal. And you would know then how to respond to those threats, whether they're credible or not, et cetera, because you know whether they would land and have an effect in your environment. So this is just another plug for, you have to drive for this information and technology management best practices before you can start worrying about sort of the world of how am I, from a smart learning point of view, going to address these threats coming at me? Because if you're not well managed, it doesn't matter. There'll be a chink in the crack in the armor that they'll get through.
All right. Broader policy, maybe policy strategic question. John Deneen, I hope I'm saying that name, the last name correctly, works in education and is asking, what is the best way we can improve cybersecurity from an education standpoint? And their particular focus is on professional and aspiring professionals, but you can take it broader at the national level. How do we do better with education and training future cybersecurity professionals?
Let's see. My answer to that is you've got to look at non-traditional. You've got to go earlier in the pipeline, right? So this is classic sort of, you want to start earlier. When I was at Capital One, I had a program which I first started at Capital One, where we actually brought in high school students who were interested in cybersecurity and had them intern as high school students. And then they went to college and they continued to intern, and then they eventually became employees. So it was sort of capturing their interest in sort of the exciting world of defending a large institution. So you start earlier. Number two is you've got to look more broadly, more diversely at people's background, et cetera, right? So security is one of those areas where diversity is super, super important, because security is one of those things where you have to look at a problem from all the various different aspects, from all these various different dimensions. And if everyone sort of has the same thought process or background, that's not possible. So you don't want, for example, a security team that's made up of all just cybersecurity experts or computer scientists. You need psychologists, you need people who understand data, you need people who understand culture and language, et cetera. If you look at sort of some of the cyber intelligence teams I've built in my career, both in government and industry, they're wide-ranging backgrounds. I had a team I built. I specifically had a PhD in archaeology who was an amazing talent who brought a completely new perspective to a bunch of threats that we faced when I was in the government, which unfortunately we can't talk about, but which turned out to be a game changer for us from a defensive point of view. So I think it says you've got to start earlier and get people interested earlier, so you build that pipeline, and then you've got to make sure the diversity of types of people and background and educations is very, very broad, so you get that wide look.
Yeah, there's a theme there with this diverse interdisciplinary approach that's applicable across so many domains. And cybersecurity is obvious because of all the cultural aspects and behavioral and psychological things that threat actors depend on, to make you click on something, to make you behave a certain way. Yeah, makes perfect sense. Yeah. Totally. Let's see, Peter Corliss had an interesting question about, we touched on it with devices in the field, but, on-prem versus cloud, there's this big trend moving to the cloud, but not everybody's jumping there, like big banks or government institutions, So talk about the thought process and evaluation criteria, private data center versus on the cloud and in between.
Yeah, so great question. So I'm super biased. I'll just tell you ahead of time. I have 33 years in cybersecurity. I've had in the seat operational roles as either a deputy CIO or CISO at very large government entities and in commercial companies. I believe companies and entities are measurably safer by being in the cloud, like without question. It's much easier to maintain, et cetera. And there's really 3 dimensions to it, and we can spend as much time on this as you want, but I'll try to give you a quick overview, right? So safeguarding benefits, including, like a reduced attack surface when you're in the cloud, right? So you get constant hardware refreshes, speed of deployment of patches, all of that sort of thing. When I was in my previous role as a CIO, there was a supply chain hack as it relates to a system that we had in our environment. We were able to patch that within our cloud-based instances measured in hours. It took literally weeks, I think 3.5, 4 weeks to do that within the data centers when I was managing both hybrid. So there's the benefits of the reduced attack surface. There's seamless integration of monitoring, right? So monitoring is built in, right? You have real-time visibility, a closed loop asset management, you have speed of detection and remediation, you have sort of, the global footprint, et cetera. And then the third one is improved data protection, right? So in the cloud, you can do all sorts of things that are really hard to do on-prem. It's not impossible, but hard to. So you get sort of data durability guarantees by the cloud providers. You also get segmentation and fine-grained least rights access control by default. You get multi-region availability, et cetera, et cetera. So my personal belief is that a transition to the cloud is not only one that better enables a company, but it also better safeguards it.
Yeah, when you at a high level, a lot of people think, oh, my own data center, I know exactly what I'm doing, I can secure it, but you don't realize the army of security professionals and IT professionals you have in the cloud that actually do all that for you and keep it up to date with the resources they have.
Yeah, and there's Sasha, there's factual things you can look at too. Like when I ran in the government, when I ran data centers, human beings ran those data centers for me. Those same human beings had hands-on to the hardware, and they had hands-on to the infrastructure. So think of the software layer that everything was running on, in addition to the applications and all of that. And they were trying to do all those things. If you go to the major cloud providers, right, they have very specifically designed their systems so the people who physically maintain the hardware have nothing to do with the people who are maintaining the software systems, et cetera, right? So there's no cross-pollination. You can't, someone, that person who inserts like a thumb drive that might have an exploit on it because, someone paid them to do it, there's no way that'll ever connect with someone who has the rights or access to manage and oversee sort of the hyperlayer and all that. So they've just, by design structurally, they're just designed in such a way that it's safer.
All right. We have like four-ish minutes left. maybe this is the last question. I don't know, depending on how deep we go, but this is kind of a good question to end on. From Samuel Jackson, not the actor, but the awesome Samuel Jackson from one of our portfolio companies, Lacuna Technologies. He's asking, what questions aren't being asked by the InfoSec community enough?
Yeah, great.
Like, what are the blind spots of the InfoSec community?
Yeah, great question. Look, we could go on and on about this. There's lots of process-related answers to this question. There's lots of technology-related. Since this is Playground, I'll focus on technology, but just let me say, when you're a security professional, right, you overly bias towards safeguarding, right? That's what you do. All of the teams I've ever run, whether I was a CIO or a CISO, I've always reminded people it's 51% of your job to enable the business or enable the mission of the organization if you're in the government that you're working with, and 49% your job to safeguard it. And the reason you need to get that tension right in the conversation correctly is the reason that we started with at the beginning of this, which is it is just as important to get safeguarding right as get enabling right as safeguarding, because if you don't do enabling right, you absolutely can't safeguard an enterprise. And what security professionals make a mistake about is not asking the enabling questions correctly. So for example, if you take a look at a classic company or government entity, there's almost always a separation between the security team and what I'll call the operations team. It is the operations team responsibility to do authentication and authorization as it relates to services and capabilities, et cetera. But the question shouldn't be from the security community to them, are you doing that in a secure way? It should be, how are you doing it in such a way that it is secure by design, right? In other words, are you doing authentication and authorization in such a way that it is continuously auditable, that you'll know if someone elevates their privileges when they're not supposed to, those kind of things. And so that's why when I talk about information and technology management best practice, so things like multi-factor authentication or network segmentation or network access control, et cetera, those are all on the enabling side, because those are things you do to enable the business. And those are the questions that the security people are often not asking. The security people, as you know, if you spent much time with them, they're thinking about like obscure threats and how do I defend against DDoS attacks and all those things that, yes, need to be defended against. But if you don't get that first part right, it doesn't matter.
Okay, I like how you describe this. Secure by design reminds me of, in engineering, we talk about quality and we always see, the product I ship, the quality sucks. Well, the way to fix that is to move quality to the left, make it quality by design. You have to move security to the left and design everything to be secure from the get-go, not after the fact. Catch it, in the air. We'll fix it up front. All right. Well, I don't want to start new questions. This has been tremendous. You're obviously a wealth of knowledge. Any high-level remarks you want to leave with, based on what we discussed, messages for the audience for them to take away.
Well, first of all, appreciate the time. As I said, I'm a big fan of Playground. I really do think security innovation is super, super important to get to the view or the model that we talked about earlier, which is sort of resilient by design, such that we can get to worrying about larger issues in 0 days, et cetera. And that'll only come from investments in companies like you all do and other VCs and companies do. So thanks for everything you do, and thanks for including me.
Awesome. We're on it. Pleasure talking to you. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Be on the lookout for our future events. We love having you. We really thrive on the questions you ask, and that makes our community and the conversation much richer. All right. See you all next time. Bye.